gracious. Thank you, Leah. I guess May, if it's okay, I'll maybe just get started since I'm controlling the screen here, and then turn it over to you. Uh, oh, sorry. Okay, there we go. Okay, May and I, we've done this presentation before, but it was in person, so this is a little bit different to be doing it via webinar. But we're going to talk kind of about some of the background information and terminology that it will be helpful to know as we go forward through the rest of this presentation and through the whole GrazeHERs series going forward, leading up to our field days in June. So this is May and I, since you can't see us in person, but that's us as when we were babies years ago. May and I have been working together for many, many years, doing different livestock and grazing uh, events and
Shenanigans.
shenanigans. Yeah, you can see that that looks like shenanigans right there. So we've been doing this for a while. Both of us come from ranching type backgrounds where we've had firsthand experience with grazing, and also help to consult with others to help them with their operations. So with that, I believe I will turn it over to May.
Yeah, so Kelly kind of alluded to my background a little bit, and part of my training was through some teachings from Alan Savory and holistic management. And the way that they view grazing is really just as one tool of many to manage an ecosystem. At the end of the day, pastures are ecological living systems with natural processes that we can either enhance or degrade with our management. So we're going to talk a lot about management today. Okay. So managed grazing. Ultimately, with animals grazing or biting the plants, we're playing around with the frequency, intensity, and the timing of when those plants are bitten. So, how often a given area or a paddock is grazed. Intensity would be about how many animals or how dense the group of animals is per acre. And then timing, time of the season, as well as how long are those animals there. And today as well, we're going to dive in a little bit to animal impact because we kind of, I like to talk about that as a separate tool from grazing because ultimately animal impact is hoof action. It's what they're leaving behind, manure, urine, and also their saliva. Saliva actually stimulates plant growth if we allow enough time for that plant to recover from it. And stock density can either be a tool for the good, right? If we allow those plants to recover from that grazing event, or it can be a tool for the bad or to kind of degrade the system, overgraze, things like that. You know, one important thing to remember, I think, and Kelly, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the average cow size, maybe that you see or that I see is probably 20 pair around the state of Minnesota, maybe 30. So I did some rough math. 20 cows can excrete anywhere from 12 to 15 pounds of nitrogen a day just in their manure. And that's kind of just rough math. So if you multiply that, that's ultimately a lot of nitrogen. But how are those animals distributing those nutrients and are you using them most efficiently? So this kind of quick and dirty table just shows that in general, the more paddocks you have in a grazing system, the more times you're keeping those animals going, the more efficient they tend to be at grazing. And when I'm saying efficiency here, so this chart is from, what's it
I'm
called?
about to drop it in the chat, the Grazing
Grazing
Systems
Systems
Planning
Planning.
Guide.
Yep. So that's a really good kind of quick and basic read if you're just kind of getting your head wrapped around the who's, what's, and whys of rotational grazing. But this chart is just to show that the more paddocks you have in your system, the greater use of any given plant in that pasture you're going to get. I feel like another good way of saying this is, if you have a bank account and 70% of it just went away because you weren't living on a budget, buying all kinds of stuff, credit card bills, whatever,
Taxes.
you would understand efficiency really quick if 70% of what was in your bank account went away. So, depending on the pastures you have available and your goals, it might be really worth it to go to extra lengths to utilize your resource better. Go ahead, Kelly.
I'm sorry, I'm clicking between screens. There you go.
So when we're talking about grazing management, that's kind of how are we managing a system? It's kind of philosophical. It's it kind of makes you think of, well, how much labor do I have? How much time? How much money? How much debt? But what I really want to emphasize today is grazing planning. And there's a bunch of different ways to do that. I'm not advocating that there's one right way to plan your grazing system, but just get started. Because at the end of the day, a drought isn't what you want to make you realize you don't have a plan. So the idea of grazing planning ultimately is let's be proactive. Let's plan how we're utilizing our forage resource. Let's budget the bank account of our grass versus just paying the bills and see what we have left. And I feel like that's the scenario that gets a lot of folks in trouble all over this country is, the cows are there doing their thing, and all of a sudden, oh, it didn't rain. What still didn't rain? It's still not raining. What do we do? Let's just not plan for it to rain enough and go from there. This also is a chart. This is from last year in Kelly and I's neck of the woods, precipitation as of July, which was pretty abundant. But my other point with this slide was just to say, and again, this rough rule of thumb, but there's science that has shown that if you get between 3 and 6 inches of rain any given point in the year, and that's 100% effective, all of it goes in the ground, which doesn't always happen. That's 1 ton of dry matter. And I really like to encourage folks when you're getting your kind of eye for how productive your pastures are, maybe you don't know the exact number, you've never done a forage clipping, whatever. Just imagine a giant 1 ton hay bale sitting out on an acre of your pasture. Are they the same? Is there more? Is there less? Just a way to think about moisture and forage availability. But anyway, so if we had 16 inches of rain, we should have several tons of dry matter in our pastures any given season. And if we don't, our management is at fault, not Mother Nature. Next slide. So again, when I'm talking about planning, if you're like me, you like things very kind of visual and interactive. I'm old school. I get made fun of all time for how many notes I take, how many notebooks I have. I'm a person that likes to have it on paper, right in front of my face, and I can scribble on it, exit out, erase, redo it. This is an example of a grazing chart. Folks can reach out to me if they are curious where this comes from. There's plenty of virtual tools, software, apps out there to help plan your grazing. But it can be this easy. It's just a chart. So having a chart in front of you, whether it's virtual or paper, helps you get animals to the right place at the right time for the right reasons, whether those reasons be sensitive features on your property, planning a vacation, making sure certain pastures get extra rest, um, making sure certain management considerations are accounted for. On here, they set aside a whole pasture. I don't know if you can read. It says summer fallow for habitat and drought protection. So in this scenario, they literally just show, hey, we're not using this pasture during the growing season because we're basically using it as a high interest savings account so that we have forage available come hell, rain, no rain. Um, so just an example of how to utilize grazing planning. Go ahead.
Okay. I think the next one is me, but I just wanted to take a minute to mention this and compare it with sort of the other idea of adaptive management. Now, this type of grazing planning is a really good way to sort of get a vision for what you will or what you could have available and lay out a relative plan based on whatever your goals are for, whatever pasture, if it is to set aside some for habitat management or, whatever your plan might be for the year. This is a really nice way to lay it out and figure out kind of when and where you're going to be moving things. Um, but you can also think more about adaptively changing that in such a way that it adapts to your lifestyle, adapts to your goals. So you may have heard this term, adaptive management. It's basically a way to manage your grazing based on whatever your goals are and your lifestyle is for the certain point in time. Um, so whereas like the chart, sorry, go back. This type of chart is very prescriptive. This would be something that I would call prescribed graze or like it's a prescriptive grazing plan that lays out exactly this is how many days we're going to be in this pasture, but it's not always going to be as cut and dried in that. So it's kind of important in my mind anyway to have something that balances the grazing chart and something more adaptive so that you can change things up based on what's going on. You can lay out your charts and your moves through the pastures based on a certain amount of rainfall, but then what if the rainfall shuts off in June and you don't get the recovery you need? It's important to change up your plan based on that. So, one thing to think about is like, for example, last summer, I started grazing a flock of sheep. I have a small flock that I'm just kind of playing around with at home and doing some intense rotational grazing with them. But at some point during the summer, I leave and go on vacation. So one thing to work into these types of management systems is your personal, your life, and what's kind of going on. So during that vacation time, I don't plan on moving my sheep every other day because I don't want to teach my hired help or whatever to come in and move fences and everything and teach them how to move sheep twice a day. So what I do for that time is I give them a larger paddock and I figure out, well, if I'm going to be gone for a week, I know that they're going to need this much space and I let them have a little bit more space for that. There's trade-offs to that with as we're going to get into a little bit more later, um, you lose your intensity, and a lot of times more intensive grazing is going to lead to better utilization of the paddock, better dispersal of manure and urine and things like that. And it's also going to result in a longer recovery time, which is really important for your forages. But that's just, like I said, just as some different trade-offs about you know how you're going to manage things. I would like to be able to move my sheep every day or two, but my life doesn't always allow for that because of different travel and life obligations. So it's important to plan your grazing around your goals and the rest of your life too. Um, so as you're planning your summer grazing, this is something to keep in mind. And this actually takes into account the possibility of grazing year round. This little graphic is probably taken from someplace that has a little bit different winters than we do. Most of the time in Minnesota, you're not going to be able to graze all the way through January, December, and March. At some point, either snow takes over and covers up snow and more so ice will cover up and make it so it's a little bit more difficult to graze through the winter. But this is just a way to map out the types of forages that you might have at different times of the year. Um, as you see, like springtime right now, here in Minnesota, this says legume, but we also have cool season based perennial pastures. Right now, that's where we've turned our cows out. They're calving right now, and we've got them out grazing on some pastures that are cool season dominated. Those grasses, they have a really big flush really early in the spring, and then they die off more in the summer, which I wish we had that on here, but we don't. And then they pick up again in the fall. So we'll graze here in the spring pretty quickly through, and then pull them off of those pastures and move them out to more appropriate summer pastures, and then bring them back in the fall. Um, but this one also brings in some different examples of summer annuals. In some places or some fields, we're able to plant some like sorghum or Sudan grass and things like that, where we've got the possibility to graze cover crops throughout the summer, or if you have a crop field that you take out of corn production for the year and put it into some sort of a forage production for the year. That's a good time to graze these summer annuals. Another option is warm season perennial grasses, like our native grasses that you find. And that's usually where our cattle go for the summer, as we have the opportunity to graze some different wildlife management areas that have pretty good summer perennial grasses. So that's a good option for summer. Again, moving into fall, a lot of times those cool season grasses are picking up again, or you may have some other opportunities to graze other cover crops. Getting into winter annuals, these would be cover crops or annual plants that you plant early in the spring, allow them to grow and possibly go through a killing period before you graze them as stockpiled forage. A lot of people do that sort of thing, stockpiling forage throughout the winter and allowing cattle to graze them after the growing season ends. Another example of that would be grazing corn stover. It's pretty common practice around here for people to leave their cornfields just chopped, not tilled under, and then put cattle out on there for the winter. And usually we supplement then with a little bit of hay or maybe some protein or something like that to get them through the winter months. So this is just, like I said, as you're planning out uh, like your grazing season and what you've got available at different times, it's important to note that uh, some pastures or some forage won't be available at other times of the year, and you take advantage of what you've got available and when it's available. Here's a closer look at that. This is just looking at just sort of your basic plant growth, a little botany 101. You think about a plant as a solar panel.
This meeting is being recorded.
Catherine, you might want to mute yourself. I think we're getting some feedback from you. Think about a plant as a solar panel. The leaf is the way that a plant collects its energy. It gets energy from the sun, and then it uses that energy to help itself grow, recover. That's how it puts down roots to take up nutrients and water. And here's a little chart that kind of shows the effect of grazing or even mowing or clipping on that plant growth. You see if you it's pretty common for people to say take half and leave half. If we take half of the above ground plant, the roots don't stop growing. Nothing dies back. But then if you take a little bit more, let's take, 70%, half of the roots will stop growing for 17 days. That's a pretty good recovery period that it needs to come back from that. But even more so, look what happens if we graze it down to the nubs or take 90% of the plant, because some people that first grass plant is wasting a bunch. You're leaving a bunch behind, right? Like, why didn't you graze that? We want to get to this 90% use. But then look what happens to the roots. 100% of the roots completely stop growing. They die back. Now, that's not bad in all situations. Sometimes we want to do that. Sometimes we want to rejuvenate a pasture and we want to go through and take everything off because those roots that die in the soil, they're adding organic matter. So this isn't necessarily a really bad situation. It can be used, and for certain, depending on what your goals are. Again, you can use this as a tool. You just remember that if you're going to use 90% of that plant, that you're going to have to give it a pretty good long rest period in order for the roots to be able to recover and regrow into those new solar panels.
Kelly, can I make a quick
Yes,
point here?
go right
Um,
ahead.
yeah, so I think that this growth curve that this shows, I mean, it's kind of based more on cool season grasses. So when we say cool season, we're talking most of what you see in like a road ditch, most pastures, at least in central and southern Minnesota, are cool season grasses, your brome, timothy, things that like cooler, wet weather that tend to slow their growth in midsummer versus when we're talking about warm season grasses, like most of your native species, big blue stem, Indian grass, what you see in a lot of CRP fields, those tend to shine and grow quite well during mid to late summer too. So just kind of adding another layer when we're thinking about plant growth and patterns.
And again, this chart was taken from that grazing systems planning guide. It's a really good resource. I dropped the link in the chat earlier, so take a look at that. It's pretty good, comprehensive overview of how to sort of take inventory of what you've got available and uh, work through the very basic grazing planning. So again, also pay attention to how much of that plant you're using. As a general rule of thumb, we say take half or leave half, but as I mentioned, that's not always the case. There are certain situations where you may want to take more, but then remember to manage your root reserves and plan your rest periods around what you've got left in those roots. If you're taking more, plan for a longer recovery period. Okay. And moving on, just again, this is from the Grazing Systems Planning Guide. This is sort of just a kind of a it's hard for me to explain. In fact, I put in my notes, it's kind of a confusing table. But what this looks at is it doesn't take into account the size of your pastures or the size of your herd. It's just a very general table that shows if you are grazing, if you have a certain number of days in your grazing period, how many paddocks do you need to have to provide 30 days of rest? And a lot of grazing systems, 30 days is sort of a minimum that we try to shoot for a lot of reasons, for regrowing the root and regrowing the leaves. Also, especially if you're raising small ruminants, parasites can be an issue. Most of the parasite documentation will tell you that you want to uh, have a 30 to 40-day return rate if you're trying to avoid having your sheep and goats re-eating up possible worms that they're shedding. So I like to say a minimum of a 30-day rest period. Um, so the size of your herd and the paddock size is completely irrelevant to this information here. But if you want to get up into like higher higher periods of rest, it's going to require that you have, or I'm sorry, not higher periods of rest, but higher days in your, or lower, if you want to do more intense grazing and lower the number of days in your grazing period, obviously you're going to have more paddocks in order to uh, get that 30 days of rest. For example, if I'm rotating every 1 or 2 days with my sheep, I can't come back to those first couple of paddocks within 7 days to get my 30 days of rest. So I'm going to need 16. If I'm doing every 2 days, I need to have 16 different paddocks for them to rotate through. And here's another way of looking at that. Moving from a very non-intense grazing into a higher intensity grazing. This is assuming you've got about 150-day grazing period. One option is to just turn the animals out and let them go and have 0 days of rest. They just graze for 150 days straight. We can make that twice as much better if we divide that in half. So now I've got 2 paddocks. I can graze for 70 days in one, graze for 70 or 75 days in one, then 75 days in the next, and each one gets 75 days of rest. The more you divide up the paddocks, the shorter your grazing periods and the longer your rest periods is just what this is showing. It also, as you get into the farther to the right side of the screen, it's more intense, but then you're also getting greater benefits to your plant recovery, fertility, forage growth, and better utilization and better recovery, which will lead to higher amounts of forage, making your bank account bigger.
I'll just make a quick point too before you.
Next one is you anyway, May. So let me know when you want me to go ahead.
Yeah. Another thing to remember here is just because that 150 days of grazing with 0 days of rest, just because that pasture on the far left can kind of support a herd and there's things for them to graze and they stay in the pasture, doesn't mean you're maximizing the resource, because what happens is the everybody knows second and third crop hay is better nutritionally. It's more tender, it's higher priced. Well, that's for a reason, because regrowth in our forages is what gives nutrition and digestibility to our livestock. So if we're in a pasture situation and we're not allowing those animals to graze regrowth on a regular basis, their plane of nutrition just goes like this. And by the end of the summer, you're going to have animals that aren't gaining and they're barely able to maintain body condition, especially if they're also subjected to hot, dry weather. So just another layer of the benefits to consider when you're allowing animals to move more frequently. And I'll touch on this in some other slides. You can go ahead and move forward. But the more you're moving animals, the more even their plane of nutrition is in general. There's lots of rules of thumb in grazing. They're rules of thumb, take them with a grain of salt, right? More rules of thumb. What is overgrazing? Can a couple folks like type in the chat what they think overgrazing is? And I'll just kind of keep puttering along here. But like, take a stab at it. I'm really curious what folks, when they hear overgrazing, what comes to mind? What do you think? And I'll just talk about recovery. So when we're trying to learn how to judge what recovery looks like in our pasture systems, another handy rule of thumb would be, at least for cool season grasses, that at least every sprig you pick up one stem of that grass, it has at least 3 new leaves growing out of its stem. So that's one just way to kind of gauge, are my pastures even recovered enough for me to graze again? Recovery periods are what dictate if we are going to have any drought reserve, if we're going to have any forage in our bank account for a non-rainy day. Something else to really think about when we're trying to hone in on what a good recovery period is for a pasture, is there any litter? And when I say litter, I mean residue, that oxidized, yellowing, crunchy, straw-like thatch layer in your pasture. And if you don't have that, if you don't have any kind of dead plant material, what you're doing is taking away food for our soil ecosystem to munch on, digest, turn into organic matter and nutrients that they'll give back to our grasses. So litter is a really important component of making sure we're managing a good recovery time. Okay, I'm going to check on some of these fun comments here. Buh, 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 buh. Grass too short to hold dew. That's an interesting one. Grazing the grass is too short or hitting certain plants too hard, right? So that's what we would call like too much selectivity. Those animals are getting a lot more options than they might really need. Plants eaten beyond point of return, weakening the plants. Yep, so that's another great one. Overgrazing, the way I like to talk about it, it's just coming back to a pasture before it's recovered. So that's why I'm sitting here talking about develop that mindset and that eye of being able to judge what's recovered for your pastures. And any more rules of thumb on this slide. Obviously, they're rules of thumb because the number range for days of recovery is very broad. It's all about your tolerance for risk, just like finances again. How much buffer do you want to leave yourself? And if you're planning your grazing, I always encourage folks to plan for at least 30 to 40 days. And if you want to get more aggressive, if you have more animals you want to add to your system, etc., then you can start cinching that number down. But at least in central Minnesota, let's plan for at least 30, 35 days before we come back to that pasture. There's just a lot of benefits to doing that. Go ahead. So again, just kind of harping on understanding recovery periods. Another rule of thumb in grazing tends to be that you need to slow your grazing moves down in times of the year that your forages are growing slower. And then if you're like in spring, like right now for most of the state, we have lots of active lush growth. And sometimes we want to move faster through those pastures because there's just more forage available. But what that means is that sorry, crying baby. What that means is if you're moving animals frequently, you have better nutrition, you have better potential rate of gain. So like if you have heifers or steers, you're trying to put a lot of weight on really fast, moving fast through your pastures, giving them the best of the best nutritionally is a great idea. If you just have really low maintenance cow-calf pairs or dry cows, you might want to just keep it a little slower when you can. So again, recovery periods ultimately dictate your grazing periods. Any comments here, Kelly?
I kind of wanted to go. Did you need to go take care of the crying baby? Because
No,
I can take over if you
I got
need.
grandma.
Good. I was gonna take it back to this thing, this really confusing slide as well. Um, when you mention like the needs of the animal too, that also goes into your planning. For example, the dry cows that we just weaned our fall calving herd, and we've got some dry cows that are just going out. They could probably have longer days in their grazing period right now. So more like the 6, 7, 8, 10, even longer, because they don't need that higher nutritional plane. But the group of heifers that we kept back that, we're trying to get some weight on them, trying to get them ready for breeding this year, we're going to want to be moving them a little bit more often to take advantage of higher nutrition plants, to give them the best of the best and then not make them go back and take a second bite or go and seek out the plants that maybe have a little bit less nutritional value for them. We want them to have the best and be able to put on weight.
I did throw something in the chat for folks that really want to kind of go down the rabbit hole with this. If you're trying to plan sort of what grazing you have available, you got to start with, okay, I want to try this recovery period for all my pastures. In this scenario, it's 60 days. And the math generally is recovery time divided by number of paddocks minus one. So that's just a really basic formula to start, like, okay, what is my minimum recovery time? And how many paddocks do I need to just achieve that?
Okay. Um,
All right. So the effect of paddock numbers on density. So when we're talking about density here, we're talking about the number of animals per unit area, whether that's an acre, hectare, whatever. So higher stock density tends to reduce the animal's ability to be selective. So you're going to have a pasture that's more evenly grazed, and essentially they're acting as a nice mobile manure spreader. All those nutrients are getting spread more efficiently the more dense we have our herd together as we're moving. In general, we're going to have stronger plant communities because of that better distribution of manure and nutrients. And if we're keeping our animals moving, we'll have good animal performance.
Here we go. Okay, so without getting into some really heavy math, we'll save that for a following uh, webinar when we start talking about GrazeHERs math and how to figure out your forage balance. I just kind of want to introduce the concept of budgeting your forage. And this is just the idea that you take into account your livestock needs. There's a certain amount of forage that a cow is going to need to get by. Generally, we figure 3 to 4% of her body weight per day. Um, uh, and you can figure out based on that calculation how much your herd needs. Um, it's going to change depending on class. Obviously, if you've got a cow feeding a calf, you're going to want to go more on the 4%. If you've got a dry cow, you can sometimes get by with 2 to 3%. But you need to figure out how much forage your herd needs. Then on the other side, we balance that with how much forage do we have available. Now you look out at a pasture and you can use a web soil survey to figure out what your potential production is for certain types of grasses or for alfalfa. So usually it's in the 1 to 2 tons per acre range, but you have to keep in mind that that's not all available all at one time. For example, when I'm looking at my pastures now, we have a lot of brome grass pastures. I kind of figure as a general rule of thumb, they're about 3,000 to 3,500 pounds per acre, but that's coming on. It's starting to grow right now. Here in central Minnesota, there's not 3 to 4 or 2 to 3, 2,500 to 3,000 or 3,500 pounds of forage out there right now. So I can't just put my cows out there and expect they're going to have all that available. So you have to take into consideration your forage growth curve. If you're grazing a pasture that's got warm season grasses, there's nothing available right now. If you've got a warm season dominated pasture, that's not going to start showing up until late June into July. So keep that in mind as you're budgeting your forage.
And one quick comment before we switch over to being this time of year, I think I have a lot of conversations with people about when their grazing season starts. Um, it's really tempting to let animals out to pastures. They beg and they plead and they have the sad eyes and, oh, we're out of hay and it's expensive and whatever the scenario is. But if you're letting animals out on to spring grazing pastures too early and you're doing it every year, those pastures are never going to produce the maximum amount of forage that they have the potential to over time. Um, because ultimately you're grazing them before they're recovered, right? If we're grazing pastures, just because there's green leaves doesn't mean that you're not going to be damaging that plant and setting it back, especially if you get into a season where it's going to be raining less.
Are you pointing fingers at me, May?
Never, never.
It's a commonly known around here that we've got some calving pastures that we just want to get the cows out of the lots because we feel they calve much better when they're out walking around on a pasture. Our spring calving pastures are the poorest pastures we have for that reason because they get kicked out just as soon as we possibly can, and we routinely feed hay out there. At some
But you
point,
guys tend to not stay on them.
no, they're out
Summer.
there. They're going to be leaving here in the next
Yeah.
week or two. But yeah,
Yep.
they go out just so that we can kick them out close to home,
Yep.
and be able to
You
keep
know
an
the
eye on
reason, right?
them.
You know why
So
there's certain
yeah,
issues there.
so there's a time and place for that, but you got. I mean, we know what we're giving up in order to do that. Um, they're not going to come back until maybe late fall from to be on those pastures again. So just something to keep in mind. So that's my little scale icon here is just you got to balance your forage needs with what you've got available and when you've got it, which is it's not all going to be available at the beginning of the season.
Just had a comment here, determining when spring grasses are ready. Again, a rule of thumb isn't always the best thing to bank on, but generally your cool season grasses like that are growing right now, at least in Minnesota, you're going to want to see 3 leaves growing off of those. So that might mean that it gets at least 6 inches tall or more. So again, just a rule of thumb. This slide I just wanted to kind of mention in my line of work. So I'm a partner. I work with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and I talk to a lot of folks that are interested in enhancing their grazing system with infrastructure, pursuing cost share, all that good stuff. The thing I get asked about a lot is, I want you to come to my farm and tell me what species are growing. And I think that's important. It's important to understand our resource base, kind of build our eyeball for, what is growing here and to understand it more deeply. But I find that in general, it's more important to understand what suite of species do your forages belong to? Are they legumes? Are they cool seasons? Are they forbs? Are they warm seasons? Because those plants tend to grow pretty similarly, at least in Minnesota. In some Western states, there's some cool season grasses that are more of a bunch grass than, kind of one that spreads rhizomes and pops back up from those rhizomes underground. But in general, in Minnesota, your cool season grasses, they're going to follow a pretty similar growth curve, which is a whole lot of growth in May, June. And then once those temperatures come up, very little growth. So just kind of wanted to talk about, suites of species being more important than really being able to identify every single one. And when we look at pastures, a lot of times if we have what we think is a weed issue, it really is a management issue, and maybe not giving our pastures enough recovery time, but also remembering too that a lot of what we do call weeds really do have value. It's when they start taking over and out competing other species that they can be a detriment. Um, and again, managing undesirable plants with our management. Um, at the end of the day, recovery time and leaving enough residual in our pastures, not leaving a lot of bare ground is gonna help resolve or prevent some undesirable species encroachment. Go ahead and click to the chart I got there. And I just like this visual in terms of, for better or worse, a lot of our pastures, at least in the area I work in central Minnesota, there's very few species. It might be 2 species of warm or cool season grasses, maybe a little alfalfa from some hay we fed, maybe some white clover, maybe some red clover, but that's about it. And so that system at the end of the day isn't very resilient. The more diversity, the more complex our pasture systems are, the more stable the sward or the composition of your pasture will stay over time, and the more resilient it is to drought, to excess moisture, to periodic overgrazing, to once in a while having an oopsie where animals got left there too long, etc. So that's kind of my point here. And we got to wrap it up.
Yeah, we do have to move along more quickly. And I think we may have lost some titles on our slides as I was messing around with them, so I apologize.
No, that's fine. I mean, this really is just some important, again, rules of thumb. We only have an hour today to talk about pasture fundamentals, so that's a tall order. But here's just kind of more rules of thumb, especially if we're trying to create resiliency in our pasture system, to avoid things like having to destock during a drought. We want to avoid having too many herds. If we have the ability to combine the number of herds on our operation, if we have that flexibility, that's going to increase your overall recovery time. Determining if you have pastures that we can leave out of grazing for the season to create our stockpile. Determining kind of our emergency plan. Can we haul water? Where can we store water? And taking action early. If you think you're going to have a bad season, it hasn't rained in a while, you're taking animals off pasture to supplemental feed, destock early is really a good rule of thumb, because once everybody starts destocking, we see issues with the market sometimes. So go ahead. And this is just to kind of bring it home as far as, there's so many grazing methodologies out there. Kelly's going to go over a few, but at the end of the day, if you don't know your goals, any road will get you there. So knowing what kind of enterprises work for your farm and work for your resource base, and managing your grazing as such is the key. Go ahead. Just skip over that.
Skip over that.
Yep.
Do we want to take a couple minutes for questions or just go over the last little part here? We can maybe address some of the ones that are in the chat real quickly.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We have a few here. One is from Amy. She's wondering what stage of plant growth should they be grazed at?
That's a great question based on my last couple slides, because I really can't answer that without knowing if you're more cow-calf. Are you developing heifers? Are you selling calves young, or are you retaining them to try to add value?
Yeah. It comes back to your goals again.
Okay. If you're cow-calf, that's also going to depend on, I find different genetics of beef cattle do better or worse on different programs. So depending on your genetics and their sort of tolerance for forage quality, for example, I work with a lot of what I call recovering dairy farmers, where they think that their beef cows need corn silage year round. And I think it's just because they don't like to hear them yell, because those animals get very used to supplementation. And then if you're retaining heifers from those animals, they're going to need supplementation too, when there's a lot of genetics out there that can survive on 12 to 14% protein forages. So the short answer would be know what kind of forage quality you have in your pastures. And if your animals can tolerate, if your animals can tolerate a lower, amount of protein, you can let those grasses get fairly mature before you're grazing them. Because a lot of folks, if they're turning out on, grasses that are 6 to 10 inches tall, they're still vegetative, there's no seed head, there's a lot of protein in those. And that's when you see it come out the back end because those animals don't need all that protein. So that's kind of a long answer.
That's great. Jesse asked the question, with native grasses having more integral root systems, does it change grazing rotational times or follow the same approximate scaling?
I would say, so keep in mind the normal growing patterns of those native grasses. Most of them are going to be warm season. We do have some cool season native grasses, but at least from what I've seen, most of them are warm season. So if you're grazing them late in the summer, there's not going to be a lot of growth happening after that, because as it starts getting cooler at night, they're not going to be putting on that growth to recover for the winter. So for those types of systems, you're going to want to graze them earlier in the year when they're having their good, their increasing growing period. And just keep that in mind, that if you do graze them later in the year, you're not going to get recovery to graze them again.
Alex has a nice question that kind of leads into that. Were there signifiers in spring grasses that they're ready to graze? Like, what can you look at the grass to tell if it's ready to graze?
I think May covered that with the general rule of thumb. Again, rule of thumb is 3 leaves. And once you hit that 3 leaves, it's kind of okay, now we can go.
Excellent.
Rule of thumb. The
Rule of thumb.
the better sometimes.
Mhm.
Another question a few people had was Jessica and Rachel were wondering about winter grazing. Jessica says, we grazed our cows on forage all winter, even through the deep snow. Worked better than she expected. But do you have tips for early spring for the 4 to 6 weeks before pastures are ready? This is where we have a grazing gap. And I'll say the same thing for myself on my farm here.
Yeah, that's often a tough time. And I answered that one in the chat. That's a really good place to stockpile some corn stubble. Don't put them out there in the fall. Save that for spring. And then you can put them out there. Even if you supplemental feed out there, they do get quite a bit of nutrition just from the corn stalks. But even better if you have the ability to, especially if you're able to get in and like fly on a cover crop or something like that, that can take off right away when you take the corn off. And then Tara also mentioned winter rye. If you have the ability to put some winter rye out in the fall, that comes up really nice in the spring. I've been eyeballing my neighbor's huge winter rye field right now. I'm like, gosh, wouldn't that be nice to put some pears on right now? So
A lot of people like having out on
winter
rye
rye.
if they
Yeah.
have it in proximity. Yeah, it's a good
Mhm.
option to fill a gap.
Okay, let's
You
I'm
probably
gonna
chug
just
a couple of these
what's that?
slides.
Yeah, I'll just actually, I think what I'm going to do, just because this is such a great infographic, I'll just sort of talk about this and we'll skip the details on them. But again, we've kind of been talking about like looking at your goals, looking at, the resources you have available of matching your grazing system to whatever your goals and whatever your resources are. So this is a great infographic put out by the U of M. I don't know if one of you U of M people could drop the link in the chat while I'm while I'm talking about it. I didn't have it ready. That'd be great, and then you guys can have that. But this is just an overview that shows sort of the pros and cons of 3 types of grazing systems that I was going to talk about. Continuous grazing, it's pretty simple. You just put out a perimeter fence, turn the cows out in the spring, say, good luck, ladies, see you later. Um, it's less management, less overhead cost, but you see that that's where we're going to have the least return on our acres. The cows are going to tend to congregate in areas where they have, maybe water, or shade. They're not gonna get nutrients dispersed across the pasture. They're not gonna use the pasture very well. They're just gonna eat what they really like and ignore everything else and allow that to continue to take over. Simple rotational grazing, and this is probably what I see the most of. It's a little bit better than continuous grazing. You've got a little bit higher cost in fences, but not terribly. You can, divide up pastures with one or two poly wires and have it pretty good. This will force the cattle into areas, different locations of the pasture that maybe they wouldn't do with continuous grazing. It allows for rest, which we've talked about is a really big thing, really necessary for optimal recovery of the forages. But we can always do a little bit better by adding some intensive rotational grazing. And you can make this there's a wide range here. I've seen people rotate cattle every couple of hours, and there's certain tools that you can get to help you do that. Um, uh, Different sort of cam locks that will like release a fence and like allow cattle to go through at a certain time. So you can get really costly here. Um, you're going to have to plan for more watering strategies, like spread the water lines across the field. So usually it's a little bit more initial cost, but the returns that you get off of it can be worth it. And as far as increasing your pasture productivity, increasing the nutritional value that the cattle are getting, and increasing the nutrient distribution of the cattle. So these next slides, I was going to go a little bit more into that, but we're getting to the end of our time. So I'll just move through them. Rotational grazing, intensive grazing. There's just some pictures of what that might look like with some different rotational grazing tools. And getting really intensive into something more like mob grazing. This is where we're talking about like 50,000 to 1,000,000 pounds per acre. You've really got those cows in there. They don't have a lot of time or space to be selective about what they're eating or trampling. They're just going to go in there and eat. And you can get, especially for a short period of time, you can really use this to heal some trouble areas if you've got some weedy areas or things that you really want to rejuvenate. It can be a good tool for that, but it takes a lot of effort, time, and money to do that on a continuous scale. I don't think we have time to get much into this. This is just different ways of measuring how much cow you have out there. And just another quick little picture of what it looks like when we're talking about stock density. Continuous grazing, you're going to have less stock density. They're going to be spread out. The more of a simple rotational grazing, you might get a little bit more density. But then as we're getting into intensive rotations, we're getting really high density, which, like I said, can be a really useful tool for certain types of pasture renovations, or maybe if you're trying to get some growth on like heifers or steers. Go back one slide, you say? Sorry, I'm just trying to catch up on the comments here. Is that what you wanted, Anne? All right. And all right. So that would be the end. And if we have time to stick around for questions at all, we can do that, but
You want to throw up our contact info slide
I
too?
will do that. There you go. I put May and then Sabrina. I'm also available to do some grazing consultations, but not as much as I used to, unfortunately. So I put the contact info for May and Sabrina. Both are on our GrazeHERs planning team, and they work in different areas of the state. May is in the Long Prairie area, and Sabrina is up in Thief River Falls. So I will turn it over to you, Leah, to close us out.
Sounds great. I just want to quick say thank you, May and Kelly, so much for sharing all that with us. I'm sure if we missed any questions, feel free and shoot an email to me and I'll get it over to someone who can answer your question. Before you go, if you haven't already, could you drop your city or zip code in the chat? It's just fun to see where everybody is from. Also, please put on your calendars our next Zoom session. It'll be the same time next week with Tara and Mercedes from the University of Minnesota, and we'll be talking about soil fertility and pasture health. And also, if you haven't already, do not forget to sign up for our in-person field days. We would love to see you there. It's a fantastic opportunity to get on the ground, walk pastures, see an actual operation while networking with a bunch of really wonderful, intelligent farmers. Otherwise, yeah, just thank you so much for being here. We're glad you're here and we hope to see you next week.
Thank you, everybody. It's fun to see some familiar names in the chat. So hello, friends.
Thanks, ladies. Reach out to me if you have questions about anything we talked about today or about cost share and grant ideas.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate you.